Order. Richard Fuller to move the motion.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Murray, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And the theme for this debate is that the House has considered the effect of immigration detention on potential victims of trafficking. And it's a pleasure to welcome my friend, the Minister, who has been extremely helpful to me in my questions over the last many months regarding immigration. It's a pleasure to see him here today. Mrs. Murray, the core of the issues I wish to raise today relate substantially to statutory instrument number 184 of 2021, which makes amendments to the guidance on adults at risk in immigration detention. And these changes, in brief, remove the special rules governing the use of detention for potential victims of trafficking or modern-day slavery, where there is a strong presumption, those rules already, against the use of detention. Now, I should note, Madam Chair, that there was a prayer against the negative statutory instrument in the form of an early day motion, number 1696, tabled on the 24th of March 2021, and that has attracted 77 signatures. I should also note that subsequent to the Speaker granting this debate, I believe a further debate is scheduled for the main chamber tomorrow, so the Minister is certainly going to be very busy, and again, I'm very grateful for him being here today. One of the reasons for me calling this debate, Madam Chair, is that Yarlswood, which has been a detention centre for women, is in my constituency. And over the years, I have worked closely with a number of groups relating to the detention, particularly of women, and in particular, Yarlswood Befrienders, Women for Refugee Women, and in particular today, I'd like to say thanks to Medical Justice for their help in putting together some points. Now, Minister, I'm going to make, as the nature of these debates of 30 minutes, I shall probably just fire a series of questions at the Minister, and I'm quite sure he won't have time immediately to respond to them. But if he is able to advise that he will commit to writing to me responses to those he doesn't have a chance to address, I would be very grateful for that. So let me start, Madam Chair, by quoting from the explanatory memorandum accompanying the statutory instrument. And it says, quote, "This statutory instrument brings into effect amendments to the guidance on adults at risk in immigration detention. The purpose of the statutory instrument is to bring people who are potential victims of modern slavery and or trafficking fully within the adults at risk statutory guidance. This is intended so that detention considerations for potential victims of modern slavery and trafficking will be made using criteria consistent with those that apply to other categories of vulnerable people." And the reason provided by the Home Office for this change to bring in a positive reasonable grounds decision through the natural referral mechanism fully within the scope of the adult at risks in immigration detention statutory guidance. And the Home Office, I believe, described this as a measure to amend a quote-unquote policy anomaly. And these changes will come into effect on the 25th of May. And so on the face of it, this leads me, if I may, Minister, to my first and fundamental question to the Minister. Why does the Minister want to make this change, which will make it more likely that victims of trafficking will be held in immigration detention? Now, the Minister will be aware that a Home Office report confirmed that in 2019, of 1,949 individuals referred into the National Referral Mechanism after being detained, 89% received a positive reasonable grounds decision, and 98% were then subsequently released from detention. However, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner noted in her letter to the Minister that, quote, "having looked at the data on the adults at risk policy between November 2017 and October 2018, the rates of rejection for detention by detention gatekeepers due to the person being an adult at risk fluctuated between 3.8% and 36%. Now, that's a wide range, she notes, but it is substantially lower than the 89 to 98% of existing rulings. And so it does seem to me that this is a significant difference, not just a policy anomaly. So will the Minister confirm today that he does expect more potential victims of trafficking to be detained for immigration purposes as a result of this policy change, and his thoughts around that? And whilst I'm on the point of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, the Minister, I did understand, have a consultation on this statutory instrument before laying it. Can he confirm if this is correct? With which organisations he's consulted, what the summary of their views and opinions were? And may I ask the Minister why the Home Office did not include the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, in their consultation prior to making these changes. Obviously, I'm quite aware the Minister will be aware, as I am, that it's important to get the all expert advice on these things prior to laying them. Now, Mrs. Murray, let's spend a moment and look at some of the concerns that have been raised about these changes. Medical Justice makes two crucial points. First of all, that these new regulations downgrade protections afforded to potential victims of trafficking held in immigration detention. And secondly, that these new regulations run entirely counter to the government's stated aim to protect victims of trafficking. So does the Minister accept that this statutory instrument will, in practice, downgrade protection for victims of trafficking? The Minister may be aware that this week the Royal College of Psychiatrists released its report, Detention of People with Mental Disorders in Immigration Removal Centres. This includes the following. It's quite a long quote, but I think it's worth listening to. Quote, "It is the view of the Royal College of Psychiatrists that people with mental disorders should only be subjected to immigration detention in very exceptional circumstances. There is substantial and consistent research evidence that detainees with pre-existing vulnerabilities, for example, mental health issues, or survivors of torture or other forms of cruel or inhumane treatment, including sexual violence and gender-based violence, are at particular risk of harm as a result of their detention. Detention centres are likely to precipitate a significant deterioration of mental health in most cases, greatly increasing suffering and the risk of suicide," unquote. So may I ask the Minister, does he or does he not agree with the conclusions from the Royal College? And does he or does he not agree that the changes made in this statutory instrument may be going directly against this advice? Now, Guideline 6.1 of the UN Recommended Principles of Guidelines on Human Rights and Human Trafficking states that, quote, "trafficked persons should not be held in immigration detention centres or other forms of custody." Now, Mrs. Murray, there is, of course, no reason, a priori reason, for the UK government to agree with everything the United Nations says on this matter. But does the Minister agree that this change risks being seen as a significant step back from the UK's international reputation as playing a leading role against modern-day slavery? By changing this policy anomaly, the direct effect on victims of trafficking and modern-day slavery seems to me to be quite profound. Because having already satisfied the Home Office that they were subject to trafficking or slavery, it seems the practical impact of this change is that the Home Office now expects that person essentially to relive that experience so that they can demonstrate the harm they will suffer from further future incarceration or detention, but this time by the government. Why would the government want to do that? May I take a moment, Mrs. Murray, to see if the adults at risk policy is working sufficiently well to warrant its application to this particularly vulnerable group? I think there are substantial grounds to suggest that it's not proving suitable for the policy anomaly change. Let me share some concerns with the Minister. Let me note some comments from Women for Refugee Women. A key reason for the detention of survivors of trafficking under the adults at risk policy is the lack of a proactive vulnerability screening mechanism before the decision to detain is made. Under AAR, a new detention gatekeeper was introduced to assess vulnerability and to provide challenge to decisions about who enters immigration detention. However, the gatekeeper only looks at information that the Home Office already holds on records to assess if a person is vulnerable. There is no proactive screening process to identify vulnerabilities that the Home Office may not be aware of before the decision to detain is made. Let me note some findings from Her Majesty's Inspector of Prison regarding Yarlswood, the detention centre in my constituency. Their reports have also highlighted how, while it was operating as the main detention centre for women, Yarlswood consistently struggled to maintain an appropriate proportion of female staff, both those in direct contact with women and managers. Further, HMIP reports also identified a lack of understanding and knowledge amongst Yarlswood staff about women's specific experience of violence and abuse, including sexual exploitation and trafficking. Now, I don't wish Mrs. Murray to cast any aspersions on the very capable staff at Yarlswood in my constituency. My point is, with this change, we're placing more reliance on individual case-based judgments and therefore on what might appear to be a rather more fragile decision process. Let me note some more comments from the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, Dame Sarah Thornton. Quote, whilst I acknowledge the rationale for bringing all categories of vulnerability under the AR policy, there are multiple factors that are specific to victims of modern slavery that are significant. Under Article 13 of ECAT, potential victims of modern slavery with a positive, reasonable grounds decision are entitled to a reflection and recovery period where they cannot be removed from the UK. I am aware that in order to detain, there must be a, quote, realistic prospect of removal within a reasonable timescale, unquote. It is therefore important to highlight that in 2019, it took the Home Office, single competent authority, an average of 452 days to make a conclusive decision. So may I ask the Minister, does he acknowledge the tension in timescales between a realistic prospect of removal and an average of 452 days to make a decision? Can I draw attention to the Independent Chief Inspector of Board and Immigration's report on adults at risk in immigration detention? The first inspection report, which was published in April 2020, noted that there is a, quote, lot more that the Home Office can and should do to make each component of the AAR policy more efficient and more effective. Further, the inspector said, I have set a deadline, which was the 31st of March 2020, for the implementation of the recommendations that are specific to adults at risk. So may I ask the Minister if he can confirm if the specific recommendations identified for implementation by the 31st of March last year have been accepted and have been implemented. I understand the 2019-2020 report is now in draft with publication due in September. So can the Minister advise if the ICIBI has concluded if their concerns have now been allayed, or do those concerns remain, or have those concerns risen? Finally, even relying solely on the concerns raised in the 2018-2019 report, did these not give the Minister pause in making these changes? As he can, in response, share what guided his thinking. Now, finally, Madam Chairman, I'd just like to touch on some comments that were in the Independent newspaper about a rationale, so the Minister can clarify. The Independent newspaper said, ministers are planning to make it more difficult for trafficking survivors to be released from detention as part of plans to prevent serious criminals from taking advantage of modern slavery safeguards by using them to prevent their removal from the country. This essentially is a misuse of a provision. But I'll ask the Minister, is this the case? And if so, what consideration did the Home Office make to improving the existing process rather than closing it down? And what consideration has the Home Office given to managing a definition of foreign national offender that will likely include actions that victims of slavery or trafficking were forced to undertake? Because many survivors of modern slavery are forced to commit criminal acts as part of their exploitation, such as pickpocketing or drug cultivation or even fraud. And in 2020, potential victims were most commonly referred to in our national referral mechanism for cases related to purely criminal exploitation, and that accounted for 34% of all referrals. I would be grateful if the Minister could just clarify on this point, because it would be a shame if the references to foreign national offenders were getting caught up with this issue of how many people who are subject to trafficking are, as part of that process, forced into conducting crime as part of their victimization. Mrs. Murray, Minister, can I just repeat how grateful I am for the opportunity to raise these points with the Minister today. There are issues with the adult at risk policy. I know it's only been introduced since 2016. I think both the Minister and I wish to see improvements to our immigration policies to make sure that loopholes are not exploited by those who do not deserve the rights to exploit those loopholes. But equally, I know both the Minister, the Home Office, the Home Secretary and myself are committed to a system that is compassionate and has eyes on that individual who might be lost in an otherwise very bureaucratic system. And therefore, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to put these points to the Minister today.